6:42 a.m. A flickering green screen. Faint echoes that shouldn't be there. One hand reaching for a telephone. 7 minutes that changed everything. June 14th, 1941. Corporal Jean Hartley sits in a corrugated metal hut perched on the chalk cliffs of Beachy Head, 530 feet above the English Channel. Her eyes are fixed on a cathode ray tube, watching the green glow paint patterns across the screen. She's 22 years old, trained for this exact moment, and she's just seen something that makes her blood run cold. The echoes are too low, too fast, too many. Her fingers close around the telephone receiver. What she does in the next 30 seconds will determine whether dozens of men see their families again, whether a city burns, whether bombers reach their target or turn back bleeding into the Channel. This is the story of 7 minutes. 7 minutes bought by a tin hut, a flickering screen, and a young woman from Coventry who remembered what it felt like when the bombs came with no warning at all. To understand why those 7 minutes mattered, you need to understand the problem Britain faced in 1941. The Battle of Britain was over. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the Royal Air Force, failed to achieve air superiority, failed to break British resistance. But the war was far from finished. The Blitz continued. German bombers still crossed the Channel, still dropped their loads on British cities, still killed civilians and destroyed infrastructure. And the Luftwaffe had learned. They'd adapted. They'd found the blind spot. The Chain-Home radar system, that revolutionary network of steel towers stretching along Britain's coast, could see aircraft flying high, 15,000 feet, 20,000, higher still. The towers stood over 300 feet tall, their transmitters hurling radio waves into the sky, their receivers listening for the echoes that meant incoming raiders. Chain-Home had been Britain's secret weapon during the Battle of Britain, giving Fighter Command the precious minutes needed to scramble interceptors, to position squadrons, to meet the enemy with altitude and tactical advantage rather than desperation and luck. But Chain-Home had a weakness. It couldn't see low. Aircraft flying below 1,500 feet, hugging the wave tops, skimming beneath the radar's coverage. They were invisible, ghosts. And by 1941, the Luftwaffe knew it. German bomber crews began flying what they called Tiefangriff, low-level attacks. They'd cross the Channel at 300 feet, sometimes lower, the spray from the waves nearly touching their bellies. They'd appear over the English coast with almost no warning. 2 minutes, maybe 3, between first sighting and bombs falling. Not enough time to scramble fighters. Not enough time to sound sirens. Not enough time for civilians to reach shelters or for anti-aircraft batteries to train their guns. The human cost was devastating. Pilots died trying to intercept raiders they couldn't catch because they'd been scrambled too late, still climbing when the bombers were already over the target. Civilians died in the streets, caught between the first explosion and the nearest shelter. The statistics were grim. Without adequate warning, interception rates dropped by 60%. Casualty rates tripled. Britain needed a solution. They needed eyes that could see low, that could spot aircraft skimming the waves, that could buy back those precious minutes. The answer was Chain-Home Low, CHL, a new type of radar station designed specifically to detect low-altitude targets. The technology was different from the towering Chain-Home stations. Instead of fixed antennas pointing skyward, CHL used rotating radar sets, sweeping the horizon, looking outward rather than upward. Lower frequency, shorter range, but capable of seeing what Chain-Home couldn't. Aircraft at 500 feet, 300, even lower if conditions were right. But there was a catch. CHL stations weren't the impressive technological monuments that Chain-Home towers represented. There was no budget for grand facilities, no time for elaborate construction. CHL stations were built fast and cheap. Many operated from Nissen huts, those semicircular corrugated metal shelters that looked like giant tin cans cut in half. Others used simple concrete blockhouses or converted farm buildings. They were placed along the coast, often on exposed cliff tops or wind-swept headlands, wherever they could get a clear view of the sea approaches. The conditions were brutal. The huts were cold in winter, stifling in summer, perpetually damp from sea spray and coastal fog. The equipment was temperamental, requiring constant adjustment and maintenance. The work was exhausting, 8-hour shifts staring at flickering screens, watching for patterns in the electronic snow, knowing that missing a contact could mean deaths you'd never see but would always carry. Beachy Head on the south coast near Eastbourne was one of these stations. The location was perfect for radar coverage, high cliffs giving clear line of sight across the channel approaches to Portsmouth and Southampton. The facility was typical for CHL, a Nissen hut measuring 20 by 30 feet, housing the radar equipment and operator positions, a smaller hut for the crew quarters, a diesel generator that coughed and rattled through the night, a telephone line running down the cliff to connect with the RAF's command network, and the radar itself, a Type 2 CHL set, its rotating antenna sweeping back and forth, searching the southern horizon for echoes that meant trouble coming. The station was manned by rotating shifts of Women's Auxiliary Air Force operators and RAF technicians. The WAAF had become essential to Britain's air defense system. By 1941, thousands of women served as radar operators, plotters in filter rooms, and operations room staff. They'd proven themselves as capable as their male counterparts, often more so. The work required patience, attention to detail, pattern recognition, and the ability to stay calm when the screen lit up with contacts and the telephone started ringing with urgent requests for information. Many WAAF radar operators were young, early 20s, volunteers who'd joined up after seeing what the Luftwaffe could do to undefended cities. They knew the stakes. They'd lived through the Blitz. Some had lost homes, family members, friends. They understood that the echoes on their screens represented real aircraft carrying real bombs meant for real people. The work wasn't abstract. It was personal. Jean Hartley was one of these women. 22 years old, from Coventry, she joined the WAAF in February 1941, 3 months after the devastating raid that had destroyed much of her hometown. November 14, 1940, Coventry had burned. 515 bombers, 500 tons of explosives, 30,000 incendiaries. The medieval cathedral reduced to a shell, the city center obliterated, 568 people killed, over 1,000 injured. Jean's family home had been destroyed, though they'd survived in a public shelter. She remembered the sound of the bombs, the smell of burning, the sight of her street reduced to rubble. She remembered the feeling of helplessness, of being unable to do anything but hide and hope. When she turned 18 in January, she'd walked into the WAAF recruitment office and volunteered. They'd sent her to RAF Bawdsey for radar operator training. The training was intensive. 6 weeks learning the theory of radio direction finding, the practical operation of radar equipment, the procedures for identifying and reporting contacts. She'd learned to read the cathode ray tube display, to distinguish aircraft echoes from sea clutter and weather returns, to estimate range and bearing and altitude from the patterns on the screen. She'd learned the radio telephone procedures, the precise language used to report contacts to the filter rooms, the importance of accuracy and speed. She'd learned that her job was to be the eyes, to see the enemy coming, to give fighter command the time they needed to respond. She'd graduated in March and been posted to Beachy Head CHL in April. By June, she'd been on station for 2 months, working the early morning shift 3 days a week, watching the green screen paint its endless circles, waiting for the moment when the echoes would appear and everything would matter. Her shift partner was WAAF Sergeant Dorothy Mills, 31 years old, a veteran operator who'd been at Beachy Head since the station opened in 1940. Dorothy was experienced, calm, the kind of person who could look at a confusing screen full of returns and immediately pick out the significant contacts. She'd taken Jean under her wing, teaching her the subtleties that the training course couldn't cover, how to recognize the difference between a flock of birds and a formation of aircraft, how to adjust the gain to see through ground clutter, how to estimate the size of a raid from the strength and pattern of the echoes, how to trust your instincts when something looked wrong. Dorothy had been on duty the morning of June 14th, working the night shift that ran from midnight to 8 a.m. Jean had arrived at 6:30 for the shift change, climbing the path from the crew quarters to the operations hut, carrying a thermos of tea and yesterday's newspaper. The morning was overcast, typical for June on the south coast. Low clouds at 1,200 feet, visibility about 4 miles, a light wind from the southwest. Not ideal flying weather, but not bad enough to stop operations. Dorothy was at the console when Jean entered, the radar set humming, the cathode ray tube painting its circular sweep. The screen showed the usual clutter, Echoes from the waves, occasional returns from ships in the channel. Nothing unusual. Dorothy glanced up, smiled. Quiet night, she said. Nothing since 3 a.m. Just a couple of coastal convoys and a fishing boat that got too close and gave us a scare. Jean poured tea, checked the logbook, ran through the standard shift change procedures. Equipment status, operational. Telephone line, tested and clear. Calibration, checked at 0600 within tolerances. Dorothy finished her notes, stood, stretched. All yours, she said. I'm going to get some sleep. Call if anything interesting happens. Jean settled into the operator's chair, adjusted the seat height, pulled the cathode ray tube closer. The green glow reflected in her eyes. She sipped her tea and watched the sweep go round and round. 6:42 a.m. The sweep painted across the screen, and Jean saw them. Faint echoes barely visible above the sea clutter, bearing 135 degrees southeast, range approximately 28 miles. She leaned forward, adjusted the gain slightly, watched the next sweep. The echoes were still there, stronger now, multiple contacts in a tight group. She felt her pulse quicken. Could be ships, she thought, could be a convoy, but the bearing was wrong for the usual convoy routes, and the echoes had a different character, sharper, more defined. She watched another sweep. The contacts had moved northwest now, closing on the coast. She did the math in her head. 28 miles, last sweep. 27 miles this sweep. 1 mile in 30 seconds. That's 120 miles per hour. Ships don't move that fast. Her hand moved to the telephone. She picked up the receiver, waited for the connection. The line clicked, and a voice answered. Uxbridge Filter Room. Jean kept her voice steady, professional, the way she'd been trained. Beachy Head CHL raid plot. Bearing 135, range 28 miles. Angel 0.5, strength 20 plus, heading 310. The voice on the other end repeated the information back, confirming. Beachy Head, Uxbridge Filter, plot received, tracking. Designate raid 47. Continue reporting. Jean acknowledged, hung up, and went back to the screen. The echoes were still there, still moving. 26 miles now. She noted the time in the logbook. 0642, raid 47 detected. She reached for the intercom to wake Dorothy, then stopped. Not yet. Let me make sure this is real first. She watched another sweep. 25 miles. Definitely real. Definitely aircraft. Definitely coming this way. At RAF Uxbridge, in the underground operations room that controlled Number 11 Group, the report from Beachy Head landed on the plotting table like a stone in still water. WAF plotters moved colored markers across the giant map, positioning Raid 47 according to Jean's coordinates. The filter room controller, a flight lieutenant with 2 years of experience reading raid plots, studied the developing picture. Beachy Head CHL had the contact at 28 miles, bearing 135, altitude 500 feet, strength 20 plus, heading 310. He checked the chain home stations. Nothing. No high-altitude contacts in that sector. That confirmed it. Low-level raid, flying under the chain home coverage. He looked at the map, traced the projected course. Heading 310 from that position meant Portsmouth or possibly Southampton. Naval targets. High value. He checked the clock. 0643. Time to coast, assuming they maintained speed and course, approximately 9 minutes. Time to target, maybe 12. 9 minutes. In the calculus of air defense, 9 minutes was an eternity. 9 minutes was enough time to scramble fighters, to get them airborne and climbing, to position them for an interception with altitude advantage. 9 minutes was the difference between meeting the enemy on your terms or on theirs. The controller reached for the telephone, direct line to Number 11 Group Operations Room. Scramble order, he said. Raid 47, low level, strength 20 plus, heading for Portsmouth. Recommend immediate scramble from Tangmere, vector 135, climb to 8,000. The operations room acknowledged. Scramble orders went out at 0644. At RAF Tangmere, 6 miles inland from the coast, the klaxon shattered the morning quiet. Pilots of 19 Squadron and 41 Squadron, on readiness status, dropped their tea and newspapers and sprinted for their aircraft. 24 Supermarine Spitfire, Mark V's fueled and armed, waited in their dispersal bays. Ground crews were already at the aircraft, pulling wheel chocks, helping pilots into cockpits, connecting radio leads. Flight Lieutenant Brian Lane, leading 19 Squadron, reached his Spitfire and hauled himself up onto the wing. His ground crew chief handed him his helmet and parachute. "What have we got, sir?" "Low-level raid, Portsmouth bound. We're gonna say hello." Lane strapped in, ran through the startup checklist with practiced speed. Fuel, on. Magnetos, on. Throttle, set. He hit the starter, and the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughed, caught, roared to life. Around him, 23 other Merlins were starting, the sound building into a thunder that rolled across the airfield. 6:47 a.m. The first Spitfire lifted off, followed seconds later by another, then another, the squadron forming up as they climbed. Lane keyed his radio. "Sapper leader to Sapper section, form on me, Vector 135, climb to 8,000. Acknowledge." The responses came back, calm and professional. Sapper 2 acknowledged. Sapper 3 acknowledged. The voices of men who'd done this dozens of times, who knew the drill, who trusted their leader and their aircraft and each other. 41 Squadron was right behind them. Squadron leader Don Finley leading his 12 Spitfires into the climb. The controller's voice came over the radio, calm and precise. "Sapper leader Tangmere Control. Your target is Raid 47, bearing 135, range 20 miles. Angel 0.5, heading 310. Vector 135 Buster." Booster meant full throttle. Lane pushed the throttle forward, felt the Merlin respond, felt the Spitfire surge upward. Climb rate 2,800 feet per minute. At 650 they were at 6,000 feet and still climbing. Meanwhile, over the channel, the Luftwaffe formation droned northwest. 12 Junkers Ju-88 bombers of Kampfgeschwader, 77, each carrying 2,000 kilograms of bombs, a mix of 250 kilogram and 500 kilogram high-explosive weapons meant for the docks and warehouses of Portsmouth Naval Dockyard. The bombers flew at 300 feet, low enough that the pilots could see individual waves, low enough that the spray occasionally misted their windscreens. Above them, stepped up to 2,000 feet, 18 Messerschmitt Bf 109 Foxtrots of Jagdgeschwader. 26 provided escort. The formation leader, Hauptmann Werner Milders, a veteran with 68 confirmed victories, felt confident. They'd done this before, many times. Fly low, stay under the British radar, pop up over the coast, and hit the target before the fighters could respond. By the time the Spitfires scrambled, the bombs would be falling and the formation would be turning for home. Simple, effective. Milders checked his watch. 6:50 a.m., 5 minutes to the English coast. He keyed his radio. "All aircraft, maintain formation, maintain altitude. Prepare for target approach." Back at Beachy Head, Jean Hartley continued tracking Raid 47, 6:50 a.m., range 18 miles. She updated Uxbridge every minute, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Beachy Head, Raid 47, now 18 miles, heading steady 310, speed 180. Uxbridge acknowledged each report, and she could hear the tension in the filter room controller's voice. The clipped precision that meant things were happening fast. Dorothy Mills had appeared at her shoulder, awakened by the activity. "How many?" she asked quietly. Joan didn't take her eyes off the screen. 20, maybe 30. Low and fast. Dorothy nodded, picked up the backup telephone, ready to relay information if the primary line failed. "Good catch," she said. Jean didn't respond, just watched the echoes march across her screen, closer with every sweep. At 6:50, air raid sirens began wailing in Portsmouth. The warning had gone out from number 11 Group Operations Room to the local civil defense authorities. Incoming raid. Estimated time of arrival 700 hours. Across the city, people stopped what they were doing and moved. Workers at the naval dockyard headed for the reinforced shelters built into the dock walls. Civilians in the residential areas near the harbor grabbed children and ran for the public shelters or their own Anderson shelters in back gardens. Shopkeepers locked doors and descended into basements. In 3 minutes, the streets were nearly empty. The sirens kept wailing. On the coastal defense batteries, Beaufort's 40mm anti-aircraft gun crews swung their weapons seaward, scanning the southern horizon, waiting for the first sight of the enemy. 6:51 a.m., 8 miles south of Portsmouth. At 8,000 feet, Flight Lieutenant Brian Lane saw them. The Luftwaffe formation was below and ahead, the bombers dark shapes against the gray-green channel, the escorts higher up, but still 3,000 feet below the Spitfires. Lane felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the sharpening of focus that came with contact. He keyed his radio, kept his voice calm. Sapper leader to sapper section, tally-ho. Bandits 11 o'clock low, Angels 2. Prepare to engage. He rolled the Spitfire onto its back and pulled, diving toward the enemy, his squadron following. The airspeed indicator wound up. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The Messerschmitts were growing larger in his windscreen. Still unaware, still flying straight and level. Perfect. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. The Spitfires had height, they had speed, they had the sun behind them, and they had surprise. Everything a fighter pilot could ask for. Lane picked his target, a Bf-109 on the left side of the escort formation, lined up the gun sight, waited for the range to close. 500 yards, 400, 300. He pressed the firing button, felt the Spitfire shudder as 8 Browning machine guns and 2 Hispano 20mm cannons opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked out, converging on the Messerschmitt. Strikes sparkled along the fuselage and wing. The 109 rolled hard right, trailing smoke, and Lane flashed past, pulling up and around for another pass. Around him, the sky erupted into chaos. 24 Spitfires had hit the formation like a hammer, and the carefully organized German raid disintegrated into a swirling dogfight. 41 Squadron went for the bombers. Squadron leader Don Finley led his section down onto the Ju-88s, which were desperately trying to maintain formation while their escorts tangled with 19 Squadron above. Finley selected the lead bomber, closed to 200 yards, and fired a long burst. His cannons hit the junkers in the port engine, which exploded in a gout of flame and black smoke. The bomber rolled left, losing altitude, the crew bailing out as the aircraft spiraled toward the channel. Finley's wingman, Pilot Officer Henderson, hit a second Ju-88, raking it from nose to tail. The bomber's bomb bay doors opened, and the bombs tumbled out, splashing harmlessly into the sea 2,000 feet below. The Junkers turned south, trailing fuel and smoke, one engine dead, limping for France. The Messerschmitt escorts finally reacted, breaking formation and climbing to engage the Spitfires, but they were already at a disadvantage. They'd been caught low and slow, and now they were fighting uphill against aircraft that had every advantage. One of the 109s managed to get on the tail of a Spitfire from 19 Squadron, firing a burst that hit the British fighter's wing and fuselage. The Spitfire rolled away, trailing glycol coolant, and headed north for Tangmere. The pilot reporting damage but under control. It was the only hit the Germans would score. Another Messerschmitt, trying to dive away from a pursuing Spitfire, pulled too hard and shed a wing, the aircraft tumbling into the channel in pieces. The pilot didn't get out. By 6:55, the Luftwaffe formation had completely fallen apart. 4 Ju-88s were down, 2 in the water, and 2 limping south with heavy damage. 3 more had jettisoned their bombs and were running for home at full throttle. The remaining 5 bombers were scattered across 10 miles of sky, their carefully planned attack run abandoned, their only thought survival. The Messerschmitt escorts were fully engaged trying to protect the bombers and themselves, with no opportunity to press attacks on the Spitfires. Hauptmann Mulders, his own aircraft damaged and streaming coolant, made the only decision he could. He radioed the recall order. All aircraft, break off, return to base. The formation, what was left of it, turned south and ran. The Spitfires pursued for another 5 minutes, harrying the retreating Germans, scoring hits on 2 more bombers before breaking off at the limit of their fuel range. Flight Lieutenant Lane reformed his squadron, counted heads, confirmed all aircraft accounted for except the 1 damaged Spitfire already on its way home. He keyed the radio. Sapper leader to Tangmere control. Bandits destroyed or dispersed. No bombs on target, returning to base. The controller's voice came back, and Lane could hear the smile in it. Well done, Sapper leader. Excellent work. Lane didn't respond, just turned his Spitfire north and began the descent toward Tangmere. Behind him, the channel was empty except for a few oil slicks and floating debris, marking where the Ju-88s had gone down. 7:15 a.m. The Spitfires landed at Tangmere, taxiing to their dispersal bays, engines ticking as they cooled. Pilots climbed out, pulled off helmets, lit cigarettes. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by exhaustion and relief. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming. In the dispersal hut, the intelligence officer was already taking reports, noting claims, times, positions. Flight Lieutenant Lane gave his account, precise and factual. Contact at 0651, 8 miles south of Portsmouth, altitude 8,000 feet. Enemy formation approximately 30 aircraft, Ju-88s and Bf-109s. Engaged from superior altitude, achieve surprise. Enemy formation dispersed, multiple aircraft destroyed or damaged. No bombs reached target. The intelligence officer wrote it all down, then looked up. You had perfect positioning, he said. How did you manage that? Lane shrugged. Early warning, he said. Someone spotted them in time for us to get up and positioned. Textbook interception. In the crew room, the pilots were already dissecting the fight, replaying maneuvers, arguing about who'd hit what. Sergeant Pilot James Lacey, known as Ginger for his red hair, was describing his attack on a Messerschmitt when someone asked how they'd managed to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Lacey took a drag on his cigarette, grinned. Someone in the filter room earned their pay today, he said. We had altitude, we had position, we had the sun. They never saw us coming. Someone else asked what would have happened if they'd scrambled 5 minutes later. Lacey's grin faded. We'd have been climbing through 6,000 feet when they hit Portsmouth, he said. We'd have been chasing them home instead of bouncing them inbound. Different fight, different outcome. The room went quiet for a moment, everyone understanding what he meant. Different outcome meant some of them wouldn't be sitting here now, meant bombs on Portsmouth, meant casualties. The conversation moved on, but the understanding remained. 7:30 a.m. At Beachy Head, Jean Hartley completed her shift report. She wrote in the station logbook, her handwriting neat and precise. 0642, Raid 47 detected, bearing 135, range 28 miles, altitude 500 feet, strength 20 plus, heading 310. Plot transmitted to Uxbridge filter room. Tracking continued until 0658. Raid dispersed and retreating. She closed the logbook, stood, stretched. Her back ached from sitting hunched over the console for an hour. Dorothy Mills was making tea, the kettle whistling on the small electric ring. Good catch, Jean, she said again. That's what we're here for. Jean accepted a cup of tea, wrapped her hands around it for warmth. Do you think they got them? She asked. Dorothy smiled. If Uxbridge scrambled fighters and they had 9 minutes warning, then yes, they got them. Jean nodded, sipped her tea. She felt tired, drained, the adrenaline crash hitting her now that the crisis was over. She didn't know the outcome yet, wouldn't know for days, maybe weeks. The reports would go up the chain of command, would be analyzed and filed, but the details wouldn't come back down to a CHL station on the coast. She'd done her job. That would have to be enough. She walked back to the crew quarters, a small Neeson hut 50 yards from the operations hut, and lay down on her bunk. The other women on her shift were already asleep, exhausted from their own watches. Jean closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. She kept seeing the echoes on the screen, the contacts marching toward the coast, the numbers counting down. 28 miles. 27, 26. She kept hearing her own voice on the telephone, calm and professional, reporting the raid. She thought about the pilots who'd scrambled, who'd climbed into the morning sky to meet the enemy. She thought about the people in Portsmouth who'd heard the sirens and run for shelter. She thought about Coventry, about the night when there'd been no warning, when the bombs had come out of the darkness with no time to react. She thought about the difference 7 minutes could make. Eventually, she slept. The numbers tell the story more clearly than words can. Raid 47 was detected at 0642 by Beachy Head CHL at a range of 28 miles. Without CHL coverage, the raid would have been detected by visual observers on the coast at approximately 0647, range 5 miles. That's a difference of 7 minutes and 23 miles. 7 minutes doesn't sound like much. It's less time than it takes to boil a kettle, less time than a commercial break. But in the context of air defense in 1941, 7 minutes was everything. 7 minutes allowed 24 Spitfires to take off from Tangmere and climb to 8,000 feet. Without that time, the fighters would have been scrambled at 0647, and by 0651, when the interception occurred, they would have been at approximately 4,000 feet still climbing, below the German escorts. Without the altitude advantage that made the attack so devastating, the tactical situation would have been reversed. The Spitfires would have been climbing into the attack vulnerable, while the Messerschmitts dove on them from above. Some of the Spitfires would have been shot down. Some of the bombers would have reached Portsmouth. The bombs would have fallen. Post-war analysis by RAF historians estimated that without the early warning provided by CHL stations, interception rates for low-level raids would have been approximately 40% lower. 40%. That means that for every 10 raids detected early and intercepted successfully, 4 would have reached their targets if detection had come late. The human cost of those 4 raids, multiplied across hundreds of similar incidents over the course of the war, runs into the thousands. Thousands of civilians killed, thousands of military personnel, hundreds of aircraft lost, incalculable damage to infrastructure, industry, morale. On June 14, 1941, because of 7 minutes of warning, 4 Ju-88 bombers were shot down, 3 more were damaged, and the remaining 5 jettisoned their bombs into the channel and fled. 0 bombs hit Portsmouth, 0 casualties. The naval dockyard continued operations without interruption. The 2,000 workers on the morning shift went home to their families that evening. The 5,000 civilians living in the residential areas near the harbor slept in their own beds that night, instead of being dug out of rubble or carried to hospitals or morgues. 38 RAF pilots flew that morning. 27 returned safely. 1 landed with a damaged aircraft but walked away unhurt. Without the early warning, RAF historical analysis suggests that casualties would have been significantly higher, with an estimated 4 to 6 aircraft lost, and their pilots killed or seriously wounded. The difference was 7 minutes. The difference was 1 WAF operator in a tin hut on a cliff top, watching a green screen, seeing the echoes, making the call. Gene Hartley never received a medal for June 14th. There was no ceremony, no photograph in the newspapers, no mention in the official communiques. The work of CHL stations was classified, the capabilities of British radar still a closely guarded secret in 1941. The Luftwaffe knew Britain had radar, but the details of coverage, range, and capability were kept hidden. Publicly acknowledging a successful early detection would have given the enemy information about what British radar could and couldn't see. So the success remained secret, filed away in classified reports, known only to the people directly involved. In October 1941, 4 months after the incident, Gene Hartley was mentioned in dispatches. The notification appeared in the London Gazette, the official journal of record for British government announcements. It was a brief entry, just her name, rank, and service number, with the notation MID. No details, no explanation, no description of what she'd done to earn the recognition. Mentioned in dispatches was a form of official commendation, a recognition of service that fell short of a medal, but acknowledged that someone had done something noteworthy. For Jean, it meant a small bronze oak leaf emblem to wear on her uniform, and a certificate that arrived in the mail. Her commanding officer shook her hand and said, "Well done." That was all. She continued serving at Beachy Head until 1943, then transferred to RAF Wartling, another CHL station further up the coast. She was promoted to sergeant in 1942, to flight sergeant in 1944. She trained new operators, passed on the skills and instincts that Dorothy Mills had taught her. She watched the screen through countless shifts, tracking raids, reporting contacts, doing the job. The war moved on. The Blitz ended. The Luftwaffe's attention shifted east to Russia. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany intensified. The nature of the air war changed, but the CHL stations remained, watching the coast, providing the early warning that kept Britain's air defenses effective. Jean was demobilized in 1946, returning to civilian life with the rank of flight sergeant and 4 years of service. She went back to Coventry, to a city still rebuilding from the devastation of 1940. She found work as a telephone operator, a job that used some of the same skills she'd developed in the WAF, the calm voice, the precise communication, the ability to handle multiple connections and priorities. She married in 1948, had 2 children, lived a quiet life. She rarely spoke about her war service. When people asked what she'd done, she'd say she'd been in the WAF, worked in communications, nothing exciting. The details remained classified until the 1980s, And by then, most people weren't interested in the technical minutiae of radar operations from a war that had ended 40 years earlier. In 1985, a researcher from the Imperial War Museum contacted her. They were conducting an oral history project, interviewing veterans about their experiences, trying to capture the memories before they were lost. Jean agreed to be interviewed. She was 66 years old, retired, her children grown. She sat in her living room in Coventry and talked about Beachy Head, about the CHL station, about the morning of June 14, 1941. The interviewer asked if she'd known at the time how important her report had been. Jean shook her head. "We just did our jobs," she said. "We saw the contacts, we reported them, and then we moved on to the next shift. We didn't get feedback about what happened after. We didn't know if the fighters intercepted, if the raid was stopped, if anyone was saved. We just had to trust that the system worked, that the information we provided made a difference." The interviewer asked if she felt proud of her service. Jean thought about it for a moment. "I feel proud that I did something," she said, "that I wasn't helpless. After Coventry, after seeing what happened when there was no warning, I wanted to be part of making sure it didn't happen to someone else. If I helped with that, even a little bit, then yes, I'm proud." Jean Hartley died in 1998, age 79. Her obituary appeared in the Coventry Telegraph, a single paragraph noting her passing, her survivors, her service in the WAF during the war. There was no mention of Beachy Head, no mention of June 14, 1941, no mention of the 7 minutes that saved dozens of lives, the people who might have connected those dots, the pilots who'd flown that morning, the controllers who'd received her reports. Most of them were gone by then, too. The story had faded into the archives, one incident among thousands, one shift among millions, one person among the hundreds of thousands who'd served. But the pilots who flew that morning, some of them left records. Flight Lieutenant Brian Lane kept a diary. His entry for June 14, 1941 is brief. "Perfect bounce today," he wrote. "Someone gave us time. We had altitude, position, sun, textbook. 4 confirmed destroyed, several damaged. No losses our side. Good day." Lane survived June 14th, but he didn't survive the war. He was killed in action on December 13, 1942, shot down over the Netherlands during a fighter sweep. He was 24 years old. His final tally was 6 confirmed victories. His diary was returned to his family and eventually donated to the RAF Museum, where it sits in the archives. One voice among many, a fragment of a life cut short. Squadron leader Don Finlay, who led 41 Squadron that morning, survived the war. Before the war, he'd been an Olympic athlete, winning a bronze medal in the 400-meter hurdles at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. He joined the RAF in 1939, became a fighter pilot, flew throughout the Battle of Britain and beyond. After the war, he returned to athletics, became a coach, helped train the next generation of British Olympic athletes. He died in 1970, age 60. In interviews late in his life, he spoke about the importance of early warning, about how the difference between success and failure in air combat often came down to who saw whom first, who had the altitude, who had the time to prepare. He never knew the name of the WAF operator at Beachy Head who'd spotted Raid 47. The connection was never made. The system had worked, but the people within it remained anonymous to each other. Sergeant Pilot James Lacey, Ginger, survived the war with 28 confirmed victories, making him one of the top-scoring RAF aces. After the war, he became a flight instructor, then ran a flying school, teaching civilians to fly. In a 1989 interview shortly before his death, he was asked about the factors that determine success in air combat. Training, he said, aircraft performance, tactics, but more than anything, information. Knowing where the enemy was, how many, what altitude, what heading. Every time we got early warning, it meant better odds. It meant we could position ourselves, could engage on our terms instead of theirs. We owed our lives to people we never met. The radar operators, the plotters, the controllers. They gave us the information. We just had to use it. Lacey died in 1989, age 72. Like Finlay, he never knew Jean Hartley's name. The story of Chain Home Low is the story of infrastructure, of systems, of the unglamorous work that makes dramatic success possible. CHL stations operated around the clock from 1940 to 1945. providing low-altitude radar coverage of Britain's coast. At peak, there were approximately 50 CHL stations operational, manned by thousands of WAF operators and RAF technicians working in shifts, watching screens, reporting contacts, maintaining equipment. The conditions were difficult, the work was tedious, the recognition was minimal, but the impact was enormous. Post-war analysis estimated that CHL stations provided early warning for thousands of low-level raids, enabling successful interceptions that would otherwise have been impossible. The lives saved, the damage prevented, the strategic advantage maintained. All of it rested on the shoulders of people sitting in tin huts, watching green screens, doing their jobs. The technology itself evolved during the war. The early CHL sets were temperamental, short-ranged, prone to interference. By 1943, improved versions had been developed with better range, better resolution, better reliability. CHL evolved into Ground-Controlled Interception Radar, GCI, which allowed controllers to guide fighters directly onto targets using radar information, enabling night interceptions and all-weather operations. After the war, the technology developed for chain home and CHL became the foundation for civilian air traffic control radar, for weather radar, for the entire modern infrastructure of radar-based surveillance and navigation. The tin huts are gone, demolished or repurposed, but the legacy remains. There's a broader lesson here beyond the specific details of June 14, 1941. It's about the nature of infrastructure, about the invisible systems that make modern life possible. We see the Spitfires, the dramatic dogfights, the heroic pilots. We don't see the radar operators, the plotters, the telephone operators, the mechanics, the armorers, the countless people whose work made those dramatic moments possible. We see the sword, not the eyes that guided it. We see the result, not the process. But the process matters. The infrastructure matters. The people in the tin huts matter. Jean Hartley sat in a corrugated metal hut on a clifftop and watched a screen. She saw echoes that meant aircraft, calculated their course and speed, picked up a telephone and made a report. It took less than a minute. That minute, and the 7 minutes of warning it provided, changed the outcome of a raid. 4 bombers destroyed instead of reaching their target. Dozens of pilots who came home instead of dying in burning aircraft. Thousands of civilians who went about their lives instead of being buried in rubble. One person, one decision, one moment. Multiply that by thousands of shifts, hundreds of operators, years of war, and the cumulative impact becomes staggering. There's no monument to the CHL operators, no plaque at Beachy Head marking the site of the station. The huts were demolished after the war, the land returned to civilian use. If you visit Beachy Head today, you'll find a popular tourist spot, people walking the clifftops, taking photographs of the lighthouse and the white chalk cliffs, and the channel stretching to the horizon. There's nothing to indicate that this was once a critical node in Britain's air defense network, that people sat here watching for the enemy, that decisions made here saved lives. The grass has grown over the foundations. The story has faded, but it happened. It mattered. In the archives, if you know where to look, you can find the records. The station logs from Beachy Head CHL, preserved in the National Archives. The operations room records from RAF Uxbridge. The combat reports from 19 and 41 squadrons. The intelligence summaries, the post-action analyses. Raid 47, June 14, 1941. Detected at 0642 by Beachy Head CHL. Intercepted at 0651 by Tangmere squadrons. Result: raid dispersed. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, 3 damaged, 0 bombs on target, minimal friendly losses. Success. The names are there too if you dig deep enough. Corporal Jean Hartley, WAF, radar operator. Flight Lieutenant Brian Lane, 19 Squadron. Squadron Leader Don Finley, 41 Squadron. Sergeant Pilot James Lacey, all the others. The people who were there, who did the work, who made it happen. This is the story of 7 minutes. 7 minutes bought by a tin hut, a flickering screen, and a young woman who remembered what it felt like when the bombs came with no warning. 7 minutes that meant the difference between interception and catastrophe, between pilots coming home and pilots dying, between a city going about its business and a city burning. 7 minutes that no one outside the system ever knew about, that earned a brief mention in a classified report, and a small bronze oak leaf on a uniform. 7 minutes that saved dozens of lives. Dozens made it home because one person, in one tin hut, saw them coming 7 minutes earlier. Her name was Jean Hartley. She was 22 years old. She did her job, and now you know. If this story of unsung heroes and 7 minutes that changed everything resonated with you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss more untold stories from history. If you're already part of our community, hit that like button to help others discover these forgotten voices. And here's a question for you. What other behind-the-scenes heroes from World War II do you think deserve to have their stories told? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your suggestions often become our next deep dives into history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.